Hiddy-di, di-di, yiddy-di, di-di, hiddy-di, di-di, di-di. Hiddy-di, di-di, hiddy-di, di-di, hiddy-di, di-di. Shalom, friends. It is wonderful to see you all today. Thank you for being here for session number 9 of 40 Great Philosophers and what they mean for Judaism. Excited to explore Thomas Hobbes. Whoa, 16th century. We are flying forward hundreds of years. No offense to the people we passed over in those hundreds of years. We always have to be selective. I hope they're not rolling in their graves, but are celebrating our study of Hobbes, and maybe they'll be interested because they weren't alive for Hobbes, and so maybe they'll get some enjoyment out of this wherever they are. Friends, let's start with a little poll question here. Little poll question for you. Get a sense of your thinking. Number 1, are people fundamentally good? Are people fundamentally good? Option 1, most people are fundamentally selfish, and they will hurt others to gain. Option 2, most people are fundamentally compassionate and they're seeking to give and love. Option 3, people are complicated, mixed, and mostly unpredictable. Okay, friends, such imperfect options, but what would you put down here for how you think of people? Okay, let's see our results here. Okay. Nobody here today said, although Aglaya, I know you were considering it, most people are fundamentally selfish and will hurt others to gain. Steve, I know you brought up the middle category. Here, most people are fundamentally compassionate and seeking to give and love. And then 70%, the bulk of the room, say people are complicated and mixed and mostly unpredictable. Okay, Hobbes is going to move us to think about what are people fundamentally. And once we determine what people are, that's going to tell us how to govern people, right? We're going to govern people differently based upon how we understand their nature to be, right? In fact, much of politics is based around that assumption of what people fundamentally are. Are they fundamentally lazy or hardworking? Are they fundamentally entitled and deserving and have rights? Or do they need to work for what they get? Are people fundamentally trying to steal unless they're regulated? Or are most people not to be suspect of such things? Our politics are based upon these philosophical views. Okay, friends, how do we prevent our neighbors from doing bad things? Left to our own devices, will human beings primarily do evil? How do we keep our worst impulses in check? What powers must be given to the government? My gosh, you look at these debt ceiling negotiations right now, and you think about what's at stake, what both sides are arguing for the whole nation to not default. Fascinating. Although his work was all-encompassing, and he was a noted scholar of humanities and classics, Thomas Hobbes is known first and foremost as a political philosopher and as one of the most important thinkers at the cusp of pre-democratic modernity. Hobbes was deeply influenced by the advent of modern science. He met the impactful astronomer Galileo and was engaged with the philosopher-politician Francis Bacon. Embracing the newly established reliance on science, Hobbes believed science could answer virtually all of our questions. I mean, it's almost absurd today, right, to think in such terms. But since science is kind of the first comer to modernity, right, before humanities, before democracy, before human rights, before feminism and social justice, right, science is like, oh, we can actually discover things that the ancients didn't know. We can actually think critically and figure things out. We don't just look backwards, we look forwards. So he believed we could answer all of our problems through science. In this worldview, humans, like all animals, were thought to be totally knowable and best understood almost like machines that could be taken apart and reverse engineered. He was critical of Descartes' view of duality, that mind and body could be distinguished. In Hobbes's view, our knowledge is derived from our sense experience, which the imagination then constructs into ideas, right? The senses are primary. Because Hobbes viewed the human being as solely a biological entity, he did not seem to account for consciousness. Because for him, everything is entirely physical, including our human experience. Think for a moment about the person who denies the soul because science can't prove the soul, right? I only know of a brain, so I'm not interested in the soul. This would speak to someone like Hobbes. We are biological entities. And just as a human being is akin to a machine, there was no reality beyond our senses. All things to Hobbes were material, made of physical matter. Hobbes's emphasis on empiricism has led many scholars to suspect he was an atheist. However, he also repeatedly emphasized, like Maimonides, that the human mind cannot grasp something like God. God is the only thing we can't know, right? So that is to say, for Maimonides, yes, there's a God, but I can't talk about God because we can't know about anything like that. Whereas for Hobbes, I can't talk about God. Maybe there is no God, right? Because what do I know? Hobbes applied his thinking to the realm of politics in his main work, Leviathan. Leviathan's a good word to know with Hobbes, which actually takes its name from the sea monster in the Hebrew Bible. The Leviathan in the Tanakh, in the Torah, is seen as perhaps God's mightiest creation. In the book of Isaiah, God is described as destroying the Leviathan when the world is brought to a state of justice. Here's what it says over there. In that day, the Lord will punish with God's great, cruel, mighty sword, Leviathan, the elusive serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. God will slay the dragon of the sea, right? My son, when falling asleep, I would say 8% of the time is thinking about the Loch Ness Monster, right? Another 8% he's thinking about some kid at school who bothered him. But the Loch Ness Monster is equal in his concerns falling asleep with the kid bothering him at school. That's how real the Loch Ness Monster is to him, right? He's pretty convinced of this beast. In any case, we've got this Leviathan over here in Isaiah and in Tanakh. And this is what Hobbes is going to think about. In the Psalms, the Leviathan is also described as the only animal powerful enough physically to play with God, right? If you are interested in God and you're just in a playful God, you should know there's a whole theology around God as playful, God as a game player. This one only touches on it. It says over here in Tehillim and Psalms, there is the sea, vast and wide, with its creatures beyond number, living things small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport with. So God is bored, so to speak, and God creates this sea creature to play with, because us humans are no fun. Like us humans are like trading stocks and eating lunch, right? God doesn't want to do like, maybe if we're playing pickleball a little more, God wants to enjoy the game, right? But if we're just out here all business, it's not so fun. The Leviathan, now there's a good time, right? In the most poetic section of the book of Job, God explains God's own greatness to Job by saying that the only God can defeat the Leviathan. God asks Job rhetorically, can you draw out Leviathan by a fish hook? Can you press down his tongue by a rope? Can you put a ring through his nose or pierce his jaw with a barb? Can you fill his skin with darts or his head with fish spears? Lay a hand on him and you will never think of battle again, right? So first we saw God as playing with Leviathan, but now we see God demonstrating power to say, Job, you can't wrestle the beast. Only I can wrestle the beast. So funny. In Hobbes's book, Leviathan, the title illustration contains a Latin rendering of Job 41:25, in which God says of the sea monster, there is no one on land who can dominate him, made as he is without fear. So for Hobbes, the Leviathan is not a monster that wreaks havoc on humanity, but a source of power symbolizing the sovereign authority of the state. Yes, there may be a king or queen, but only because a head is necessary for there to ensure the preservation and stability of the body, right? The body are the people. The head is the king or queen. They need each other. Hobbes's Leviathan embraces social contract theory as the foundation of the state. In this theory, a social contract is an actual or hypothetical compact between the ruled or between the ruled and their rulers, defining the rights and duties of each. However, Hobbes's social contract theory is a bit different from what we might be familiar with regarding modern democracies, of course, because this is pre-democracy. For America, the Declaration of Independence is an actual moment in history where people came together to form a new republic. It makes clear that the government gets its powers, quote unquote, from the consent of the governed. Hobbes's social contract theory, however, is more of a myth. For Hobbes, as Encyclopedia Britannica explains, we must make the assumption that in primeval times, individuals were born into an anarchic state of nature. They then, by exercising natural reason, formed a society and a government by means of a social contract. So the reason we must assume such a thing, even if it cannot be factually proven, is because it is essential that the people see the sovereign as legitimate. Any undermining of the sovereign's authority can lead to its removal and a descent into chaos. Hobbes's theory of government is not inherently monarchist, but it was shaped by the English Civil War, which took place in his lifetime. When the people rose up against the monarchy, Hobbes sided with the king. He supported having a strong government because he felt that without a sovereign, humans were condemned to a brutal stage of nature, which he calls a war of all against all, right? Famously. It is not so much that Hobbes thought human beings are particularly violent, but that without any law or authority to mediate between people, individuals would have no choice but to violently pursue their self-interest in order to protect themselves against others. In the state of nature, human life is, in Hobbes's memorable words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The only way to ensure that people can live together peacefully is if there is a sovereign who can make the law and enforce it by force if necessary. So it may feel like partisan politics are, a new thing, right? But when the Democratic Party lashes out at Mayor Adams in New York City, because Adams is demonizing the Biden administration right now for being too pro-migrant, and how in a upcoming presidential election can the mayor of New York City be criticizing the president when knowing the chaos that will emerge if he doesn't win, right? That sense that that Adams has a migrant crisis in New York City he can't handle, and he thinks Biden's allowing too many people in, and thus critiquing him. And the sense is you will topple the whole system if you critique him, if you demonize him on this issue. And so too, that sense that I don't care if you like the king or hate the king, if the king falls, we're all in trouble. Everything will be destroyed. And so you're gonna have to decide, do you really want to be an agitator? Do you really want to push back when the whole system's at risk? And Hobbes says, no, like, love the king, hate the king, right? It's the best we got. And without it, we're going to have total chaos and civil war. In the Jewish tradition, Hobbes' sentiment about the dangers of collective life without sovereign authority is shared in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, compiled over 1,000 years earlier. There it is recorded, Rabbi Hanina, the vice high priest, said, pray for the welfare of the government. For were it not for the fear it inspires, every person would swallow their neighbor alive, right? Just like Hobbes said, without strong central government, people will kill each other. So, right, without strong policing, people will kill each other. And I'm sure we have a range of views on policing, but that is a common view in American society, that without strong regulations, without strong enforcement, there will be more violence rather than less. Who will people call when they are at risk physically? So too, the rabbis say, pray for the government. It doesn't say good government. Pray for the government so people fear it and that it's strong. Because if people don't fear the government, and if they cheat on their taxes, that they'll go to jail, and if they kill someone, that they'll go to jail, right? And if they abuse someone, that there's going to be consequences, then people will just swallow each other alive, because people are motivated by fear of consequences, right? People are not just motivated altruistically. People are motivated to not do bad because they will be caught. I'm not going to show up late at work because I'll be seen late at work. Not that, oh, I want to do my best at my job. I will not go through the red light, not because I think it's bad to go through red lights, because I don't want a ticket. I don't want a ticket, right? Why do people follow laws? Why do people follow rules? Fundamentally, that's a major shift in moral development, to get to the point where one lives by principles rather than fear of consequence. But according to Hobbes, and according to most, I would even argue that most people haven't reached that level where they operate by the good. They operate by not getting caught, ultimately. How many people would commit adultery if they knew they wouldn't get caught, right? How many people would do all kinds of things? Okay, though Hobbes derives his model of political sovereignty from the biblical example of God's sovereignty, a closer look reveals the ways in which his political thinking differs dramatically from that of the Torah. For Hobbes, it was essential not only that there be a sovereign who is granted authority over the state, but that the sovereign's power must be absolute. Unlike modern democracies, which depend on a separation of powers and checks and balances, Hobbes argued against these things out of fear that they could undermine the sovereign's authority and usher in chaos. Hobbes shows a remarkable lack of concern for the potential abuses of a power that the sovereign may inflict upon his or her subjects, which stands in marked contrast to the Torah's approach to sovereignty. When the Jewish people approach the prophet Samuel to appoint a king for them, he makes clear that giving one person so much power will inevitably lead to its abuse, right? I want to remind us, Judaism was anti-monarchy up until this point, until Judaism became a monarchy tradition. Through King Saul and King David and through King Solomon, through the aspirations of Talmudic Judaism and biblical Judaism of a return of monarchy with a third temple, ultimately. Here's what it says over here in Sefer Shmuel, the great book of Shmuly, right? The book of Samuel. This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. The day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day. Right? Samuel is warning the people of what happens when you have a monarchy. Furthermore, Samuel emphasizes that by appointing a king and showing obedience to a human sovereign, the Jewish people risk turning away from God and engaging in an act tantamount to idolatry. In the Bible's perspective, the king is sovereign, but he must share that sovereignty with others, particularly the prophets, who have a responsibility to rebuke the king if he violates God's law. For Hobbes, the human sovereign is above the law, makes the law, and enforces it as they see fit. In the Torah, the king is neither above the law nor its source of law. Rather, he must carry around a Torah scroll at all times as a reminder that God is the one true sovereign to whom he must show obedience. What do we make of Hobbes as Jews? To me, his reduction of the human being to their physical nature strikes me as a very flawed and simplistic understanding of human nature and human experience. Hobbes was also not a strong defender of religious liberty. He believed that regardless of our personal views, we should obey the sovereign's view of religion to avoid conflict. Awfully convenient for him. This lack of separation between religion and state has historically been destructive for Jews and other minorities as well. There is, however, an alignment with Jewish values in how Hobbes believed that those who could not survive on their own labor deserved public support. All of Hobbes's philosophy, though, stems from a view of human nature that denies the complexity of the human being, the place of a soul, and any recognizable concept of transcendent God who demands justice to whom we are all accountable. There appears to be no place in his thought for any kind of spiritual relationship or engagement. His view of the human being was a low one. We're not only merely physical, but we're also selfish, as opposed to a more Jewish view that we're bearers of the image of God, whose inclinations do both good and bad. However, we can recognize the value of being realistic about the need to rein in the worst human behavior to maintain moral order. The Jewish approach, though, might have a different solution for how to keep people moral without depending solely on the authority of the sovereign. We can largely accept Hobbes's premise that without law, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But we can also take the view of the Jewish legal tradition that in addition to earthly sovereignty, we also need halakha. We need God's law, so to speak, as a set path to guide and govern us, right? We need a higher calling beyond just secular law. We need principle and conscience, morality, beyond just policing. Further, we have a complicated relationship to Hobbes's notion of supporting the sovereign. Given the history of monarchies as systems of exploitation with largely no concern for the poor common person, the idea of the social contract, that the government has responsibilities to the people, is potentially an improvement on previous systems. It was a crucial advancement that Hobbes was not merely pushing people to merely submit to the monarchy, but also to see the value in our social contract. By offering a justification for sovereign authority, Hobbes implicitly acknowledges that sovereignty is not absolute and rather is dependent on the will of the people. So too, ancient Judaism definitely did embrace a form of monarchy, and it certainly also supports the need of some governmental authorities to regulate violence and maintain order. Nonetheless, aspirationally, we should seek to amplify the individual's greater moral potential for compassion and care and for reason, rather than diminish them altogether. We should also recognize that the more that sovereign authority is invested in a small number of individuals, the greater likelihood for its abuse. Participatory government has long been a hallmark of modern democracies, and it is an essential safeguard against the abuse of power. So for us, though, the social contract goes beyond the government, as we also have a covenant with God. The human side of this contract is demonstrated in the book of Exodus, when the Israelites say upon receiving Torah, right, in our holiday coming up this Thursday night, Shavuot, all that the Lord has spoken we will faithfully do. While traditional Jews have little problem giving up some freedom to act according to the quote-unquote will of God, Hobbes applies this kind of submission to the state, which is not something we should readily support. While we can make a king out of God, we know that no human authority can truly live up to that standard. Democracy, rather than a monarchy or oligarchy, is the least damaging form of earthly authority. So to conclude, friends, of course, for Jews, we know also too well the history of powerful governments turning against the people they rule over. The ideal image of government we imagine should probably not be a terrifying biblical sea monster, which indeed Tanakh describes as something God will defeat. Instead, we might want to imagine society as described in the Torah, in which the community has a special responsibility to make sure everyone's needs are met and everyone is their brother's keeper. Because for those who felt we might have been doing too much God talk in philosophy, you'll be pleased to know we've made a transition now because philosophy and theology were kind of deeply intertwined up to this point. We saw that in the medievals. We saw that in the ancients. I mean, the Greeks were a little bit complicated anomaly, but certainly in the medievals that we were looking at, the Muslims and Maimonides. And now as we're moving into pre-modernity, we're going to see a real separation, separation, and the birth of the secular state, of secular democracy, of philosophy being divorced from theology by and large. Of course, it's never psychologically fully divorced because people's beliefs inform their ideas. But in many ways, we are now moving into a new era of pre-modernity and modernity. We're going to go to Descartes next week, and then into Locke and into the utilitarians. We are in a whole new territory. I'm sorry, I can't speak to the East. I really, we did the Buddha and we did Confucius, and I am just not a scholar in Eastern philosophy. And it would be so amazing to be able to go into that as well. And I wish I could speak to it, but I hope you'll research it. And I know you know a lot already and share back with us. But in terms of the Western philosophical world, this is a big turning point. This is absolutely a big turning point. And what it really means is that the theological dogmas were replacing critical thought in many ways. And critical thought explodes because of this break from the church. Because and in the Jewish world as well, of course, but by and large in the Western Christian world, the break from that, and now religion has its place. It's not central. Okay, there's a place for religion in my life, but it's very different than the place of science, the role of government, the role of the personal life, the role of community. And so it becomes minimized in many ways, okay, lots more to say there, but we're at our time here, friends. So I thank you so much for joining.